How to Do Things with Words by J. L. Austin. A work in the philosophy of language, first published in 1962. The main ideas of which are: there appears to be a contrast between merely saying something and doing something. This is the contrast between constative utterances, such as stating, and performative utterances, such as promising. Detailed examination of this contrast shows that it is not fruitful. Detailed examination of this contrast shows that it is not fruitful. To say something is to do something. In fact, it is to do many things. Locutionary acts consist, among other things, of uttering words with a sense of and reference. Illocutionary acts are governed by conventions and include such things as promising, swearing, and stating. I nearly gave you an example of swearing when I stumbled on my words there to begin with. Well, swearing has its reasons. Otherwise we wouldn't do it. And that is the doing, which is the whole point of this essay. Anyway, perlocutionary acts are natural acts, such as persuading or angering, consequent upon illocutionary acts. Right. How to Do Things with Words is a reconstruction of J. L. Austin's William James lecture at Harvard in 1955. First published posthumously under the editorship of J. O. Urmson. Austin's views on the matter discussed in the lectures were first formed in 1939, and he made some of them in his address. Other Minds to the Aristotelian Society, 1946. Between 1952 and 1959, he lectured on the same topic, sometimes under the title Words and Deeds. Much of Austin's philosophical reputation rests upon his incisive and acerbic criticism of the views of other philosophers. For example, his withering attacks on the views of A. J. Ayer and G. J. Warnock. In Sense and Sensibilia, How to Do Things with Words. Sense and Sensibilia. His name's Austin, you see, although it's spelled differently from Jane Austen, but he couldn't resist it. Sense and Sensibilia, after Jane Austen, Sense and Sensibility. Anyway, Sense and Sensibilia, How to Do Things with Words. Like making jokes. A first-class piece of constructive philosophy. Austin invented speech act theory. Before him there was no such theory, and his theory has been used, revised, and extended not only by philosophers, but also by linguists, linguistic anthropologists, sociologists, cognitive psychologists, speech communication theorists. Austin begins his lectures in modest mode, and I quote, "What I shall have to say here is neither difficult nor contentious. The only merit I should like to claim for it is that of being true, at least in parts." End quote. That's modest, is it? Oh well. Sort of. Coming from most philosophers, such modesty would hardly be disarming. Coming from Austin, it is simply the first of those many parts that are true. He then recounts with approval the attempts to recognize that some purported statements are strictly nonsense and to account for why they are nonsense. He also lauds the discovery that some apparent statements do not purport to state facts, but to evince emotion or to prescribe or otherwise influence conduct. These efforts and discoveries have developed piecemeal, he thinks, but also amount to a revolution in philosophy, about which he says, and I quote, "If anyone wishes to call it the greatest and most salutary in its history, this is not, if you come to think of it, a large claim." End quote. What he proposes to offer the revolution is a manifesto, or to drop the manifesto, the metaphor, a theory that describes the utterances that masquerade as statements. He calls such utterances performative. Performatives have two characteristics. First, they do not describe or constate anything at all and are not true or false. Second, to utter the performative sentence is not merely to say something. Austin's first examples of performatives are "I do," uttered by a bride or groom. Another is "I name this ship Queen Elizabeth," uttered by someone smashing a bottle of champagne against the bow. "I give and bequeath my watch to my brother," as occurring in a will. And "I bet you sixpence it will rain tomorrow." Based upon these examples, it may be tempting to think that to say the right words is the same as to do the action at issue, but that is not correct. In general, the words have the proper effect only if uttered in appropriate circumstances, and only if the participants are doing certain other physical or mental things, for example, breaking the bottle of champagne. Further, for some acts, words are not necessary at all. Marrying might be accomplished by cohabiting, betting accomplished by inserting a coin into a slot machine. Austin's examples of performatives are sufficient to prove that there is some distinction to be drawn between them and constatives. And I quote, "But now how, as philosophers, are we to proceed? One thing we might go on to do, of course, is to take it all back. Another would be to bog, by logical stages, down. But all this must take time." End quote. Constatives are true or false. Performatives are not. Rather, because they are types of actions, they can be done well or badly. Austin, in his doctrine of infelicities, concentrates on how they can be performed badly. For one way to learn how a machine works is to see in what way it can break. As a kind of action, performatives are subject to all the defects that any action is. As linguistic acts, they have some special problems. Without pretending that the list is exhaustive, or that its items are mutually exclusive, he mentions three conditions on performatives, conditions which, if contravened, give rise to infelicities. First, A conventional procedure having a conventional effect must exist, and it must require that certain words be uttered by certain persons in certain circumstances, and the persons and circumstances must be right ones for invoking the conventional procedure. Second, the procedure must be performed correctly and completely. Third, when the procedure requires certain thoughts, feelings, or intentions to act subsequently in a certain way, the participant must have them and in fact perform the intended action. If an action is infelicitous for contravening either the first or second here, the action is a misfire. The attempted performative is a failed attempt. The act is null and void. If an act is infelicitous for contravening the third one, then the performative is successful but defective for abusing the procedure. This classification is helpful and instructive, even though the borders between the first, the second and the third are not always clear, and it is not always possible to decide whether an infelicity belongs to one kind or another. It is important to be attentive to these deficiencies in the classification, and I quote, "and we must at all costs avoid oversimplification, which one might be tempted to call the occupational disease of philosophers, if it were not their occupation." Although performative utterances are not true or false if they are felicitously, that is, non-defectively performed, they are related to statements that are true. For example, if a person felicitously asserts, or utters rather, "I apologize," it is true that he apologizes, true that the person had offended or otherwise injured the addressee, true that he commits himself to not repeating the injury, and so on. The way in which a performative is related to some true statements is analogous to the way in which constatives are related to some true statements. The sentence "all men blush" entails "some men blush." Saying the cat is on the mat implies that the speaker believes that the cat is on the mat, and "all Jack's children are bald" presupposes that Jack has children. See P.F. Strawson's Introduction to Logical Theory. So constatives are more like performatives than first appeared to be the case. They are being assimilated. There are other reasons for assimilating constatives. The truth of "I am stating that John is running" depends upon the felicity of the speaker saying, or having said, "John is running." So at least some constative utterances have felicity conditions. On the other side of the distinction, some performances are false. The warning, "I warn you that the bull is about to charge," is a false warning if the bull is not about to charge. These matters raise doubts about the performative-constative distinction. Is there a way to make the distinction in grammatical terms, by grammatical criteria? Many but not all performatives have their main verb in the first person singular, present tense active, indicative mood. But "you are hereby authorized," "passengers are warned," "notice is hereby given," and "turn right" are exceptions. Thus neither person, number, tense, voice, nor mood can be used in a simple criterion. The first person active, present tense remains. However, an attractive base upon which to build a criterion. For notice there is an asymmetry between a performative verb in this form and the same verb in other persons, tenses and moods. If I utter I had bet, or he bets, or they might have bet, I describe a certain action, but no action is described if I utter the words I bet. Rather, to say I bet in the right circumstances, frame of mind, and so on, is roughly to bet. Austen's strategy for devising a criterion is then to make a list of verbs having this asymmetry and to reduce other performative utterances to this form, which Austen calls explicit performative form. To be continued. Catch the next one in this series, where I get very explicit. I bet you can't wait.